hard to go last. It's really hard to follow you, Iman. It's hard to follow you, Brad, always. And I'm grateful for your testimony. I'm grateful, Brad, for your documentation and that we're telling the stories of people. We're lawyers. Are there other lawyers in the room? No? Great. Oh. No, but this is, these are human stories. And so thank you for you all for being here and for listening to these stories and hopefully doing something to answer the question that Brad asked at the end of what to do. I think if we can remember one thing, the trigger is impunity is perfect. The reason we're here is to talk about accountability, what can be done. What can be done with these stories. I'm going to start, and I'll introduce myself a little bit later, because I actually had at the very beginning of my talk to speak about the Kawari family. The Kawari family is a case of Adalas. Adala is a legal center. We are a Palestinian human rights organization based in Israel. So it's a unique position where we take cases from working with partners who are based in Gaza, the Al-Mizan Center for Human Rights, Palestinian Center for Human Rights, and take those cases through Israeli legal channels. So that's our main work, is how do you use or can you use Israeli legal channels to hold Israelis accountable for these acts, knowing, of course, that that's not possible. We'll talk a bit about that. And why then lawyers continue to do that. Why do we continue to use those channels? And I'll say that in many ways it's to tell this story. It's to tell the story that the channels available do not work, that impunity indeed is systemic, it prevails across the board, and as Brad said, the impunity is the trigger for the next offensive. We talk about accountability because we're asking for non-repetition, for never again, as Iman said. So just to talk a little bit about the Kawari family, because it tells both about the methods of the attacks that Israel used, but also the investigation, which is what I'm going to focus a bit on. So you heard the story and you saw the pictures. It was the 8th of July, 2014, a really important day for the people in this room. Again, this was a 3-story building. 5 families lived there. The wife of the eldest son, Odeh, got the phone call from the Israeli military. So this is the warning. Under international law, as Brad was saying, warnings is one of the obligations of the military. Whether or not those are effective is the question. So the telephone was received, then you have the small missile, the small roof knocking it's called. Imagine, it's called a roof knocking. This particular roof knocking caused the roof to collapse. This roof knocking caused the roof to collapse. So you have, imagine a situation, you have 5 families to get evacuated, the roof has just collapsed, so the small missile created a huge amount of damage. People who did evacuate would leave, there were others who came back, thinking, of course, this is it, this was the attack, when the bomb was dropped on the home. 9 civilians killed, 6 children. So Adala and Al-Mizan, our partner in Gaza, filed a complaint immediately. So what we do is we file a complaint to the Military Advocate General, alleging war crimes. And as Brad said, civilian object. This is a residential home. Indiscriminate war crime. One of the impacts of this case is that in the summer of the impacts of this case of the war, the summer of last year, the UN created this independent commission of inquiry, if you've been following this a bit. So an independent commission of inquiry was created to look into these cases. They investigated the Kawari case, and they said, as they were investigating, exactly as we said, it's a civilian object, war crime. It may involve war crimes. Obviously, they're not investigating properly. They didn't have access to the Gaza Strip, but as they're looking at the facts of the case, this is what they said. The Israeli military said no need for an investigation in this case. Not we investigated and we closed the investigation. No need for an investigation in this case. The building, they said, was used for a military purpose. That military purpose is kept secret. So all of this is secret evidence. And there was a roof knocking. So one, it was a military purpose. We don't say why that was, or who that was, or when it was used as a military purpose. As Brad said, once it stops being used for that purpose, it's again a civilian object protected under international law. So they said, this is an operational thing, no need for an investigation. The second case, July 16th, this is one of the defining moments of the war for those of us who were not there, who were watching from afar in horror as this unfolded over the course of last summer. July 16th, Ahed Atef Bakr, 10 years old. Zakaria Ahed Bakr, 10 years old. Mohammed Ramis Bakr, 11 years old, and Ismail Mahmoud Bakr, 9 years old, were killed when Israeli forces shelled a beachfront on the Gaza Strip. These kids were playing soccer. It was in front of, if you saw it, in front of tons of media. It was in a public beach on the Gaza Strip. This case is critical because it shows the failures of Israel's investigative system. And this is what the Commission of Inquiry said. They looked at this case because what happened? This was one of the 6 cases that was opened. So there was an investigation on this case. And you wonder why. I mean, there was a ton of attention. Do people remember that day? Do you remember that moment, those who were following this? So there was a ton of international attention. The media was all over this. They were right there. So they opened the case. They did open the investigation. And then, after the investigation, closed. No war crimes, absolved of complete responsibility for the targeting of these children. They said the attack was this shack where the kids were playing. That was the military objective. It was used for military purposes. Though they acknowledged, even as they're writing to the lawyers of the case that submitted this case with our partner at Mizan, they said there weren't ongoing hostilities. We acknowledge that, but it was used for military purposes. And 2, we could not distinguish that these were children. We didn't know that these were children. No wrongdoing, no war crime, complete impunity. How did this work out? We submit the complaint to the Military Advocate General, and the Military Advocate General sends out a fact-finding assessment mechanism, and I'll talk about this. This is a new thing that was established in September of last year. This is an independent, quote-unquote, independent assessment mechanism, though it's within the hierarchy of the military. So it gets orders from the military, it responds to the military. This fact-finding mechanism was supposed to go out and investigate. Adela submitted 4 affidavits, 3 witnesses, 1 11-year-old survivor. They called the 11-year-old survivor to come to Erez Crossing. We have a colleague here, Gerard, who's from the American Friends Service Committee, who just came from Gaza. Erez Crossing. So they say to this 11-year-old child, come to Erez. He has no lawyer. His father could have come with him. Post-traumatic stress, 11-year-old survivor, 4 of his cousins are killed. He didn't end up coming, but they had 3 other adult witnesses. They didn't call those witnesses. So the witnesses were not called. No foreign press was approached. And so we wonder, where are they getting this information? How are they assessing the situation? How are they assessing the incident when witnesses were not approached? Incident is closed. Investigation was opened. Investigation is closed. That is one of 6 that was opened. So we have, as we'll talk, Adela itself, for example, submitted 22 complaints. 22 complaints, and we're choosing them for a specific reason. The incidents are responding to what Brad laid out as far as what are the violations of international law. So was this a civilian object? Was it a home? Was it direct targeting of civilians? Were there kids on the beach? Was it protected property under international law like hospitals or schools, ambulances? Was it media? So these are the cases that we're taking. So we're a legal center. We're also a human rights organization that's looking to make an impact. So if you get a good case, if you get a case that exposes a policy that is illegal under international law, that's the kind of case we're taking. So we submit 22 of those cases to the Military Advocate General. Only So we had this response on the UNRWA schools was the other of the 5 cases that were opened. So the 2 cases that were opened by the Military Advocate General so far that Adel submitted and that human rights organizations are putting forward are the kids on Gaza beach. It was closed in June. And the ongoing investigations into the targeting of UNRWA, the UN schools, their UN schools. So these are also protected under international law. And so we're saying, so we have these 22 incidents and we're requesting independent criminal investigations. 7 of those cases, like the Kawari family, no investigation needed. 9 of those cases we're still waiting for responses. So you have concrete evidence that these domestic investigations aren't working properly. And the reason, what's interesting too, I think about the way that we work, people often ask why. Why is Adala going to the Military Advocate General when you know from experience that they're not going to open these cases? What do I mean by you know from experience? Brad talked about Operation Cast Lead. This was before last summer, the largest military offensive on the Gaza Strip. Operation Cast Lead, 2008, 2009. So again, approximately 1,400 Palestinians were killed. 400 incidents were examined by the military. So presented to the military by human rights organizations, looked into by the military. 52 resulted in an opening of a criminal investigation. So they looked into 52. 3 resulted in the filing of indictments. 3 resulted in filing of indictments. The most severe punishment was delivered in the case of the theft of a credit card. 1,400 Palestinians were killed. The most severe punishment for soldiers was the theft of a credit card. And I think, in fact, what you're seeing is the same. And how do we know that that's going to continue to happen? Well, you look at the defense minister. So this is Moshe Ayalon, Defense Minister Moshe Ayalon, when he's talking about what he perceives to be, to warrant a criminal investigation. He says that if someone during battle committed a crime, not a war crime, committed a crime, for example, looting, rape, deliberately shooting a woman or a child, waving a white flag, not just child, but if they're waving a white flag, that's breaking the law and that's criminal. So he says that's when we'll start the investigation, and in fact that's what what's happening now. So what's the only indictment to happen from this war? Looting. The only indictment, one indictment is for looting 2,240 shekels. This is $600 from a house in Shujaiya. Shujaiya was the site of a massive, massive military incursion. Ground operation was flattened, devastated, devastated. The UN Commission of Inquiry dedicated pages to this operation and said, in fact, the entire operation looks like a war crime. The entire operation in Shujaiya looks like a war crime. And what we're seeing out of Israel is a willingness only to investigate looting. So, for example, a similar case of Shujaiya, Rafah, so this is known as Black Friday. And if anyone saw today, Amnesty International together with Forensic Architecture, amazing organization that DCI works with closely, just released a report on Black Friday. This Rafah killing, if you remember, 135 people were killed in a massive storm of military ground incursion into Rafah in southern Gaza after the kidnapping and killing of an Israeli soldier. And so they were looking at that and said, this is a war crime in the way that it was handled. Again, the Defense Minister Moshe Ayalon will say this is potentially operationally problematic, but certainly not a war crime. Domestically, what else can be done? So we're using the domestic legal channels in some ways to show that they're not working. There were some changes. I mentioned the fact-finding assessment mechanism. So this is something that we go to, say, the UN or to the EU or even here, we hear it all the time. Because on the part of Israel, this is a huge change, that they have this new fact-finding mechanism that's investigating the war. And we're saying, we've tested it and it doesn't work. It doesn't work. It's not holding anyone accountable. Just a few other things about what, if you're thinking, what else is Adela doing? What else are human rights organizations doing? What else can be done? it's all to say very little. Domestically, the Israeli Supreme Court has a policy of non-intervention to these decisions. So in 2011, in a case that was looking at the duty to investigate, the Supreme Court says we have, as is well known, a principle of maximal restraint in judicial intervention in the decisions of the military. Maximal restraint. So it should only occur in exceptional circumstances. So the ruling is saying that even if there are petitions that are alleging suspected war crimes, even if we were to focus on specific incidents, support that with strong evidence, they're unlikely to go forward in the Israeli Supreme Court due to this policy of maximal restraint. So the Supreme Court doesn't intervene. Additional barriers, obviously, Brad said the blockade. If you were to, there's a lot of barriers for people, not even in criminal courts, but in civil courts. They say we have a case against the military for injuries. So many barriers for Palestinians to access justice, which is critical for again, non-repetition. So Adala, in addition, as it's doing its legal work, is also working in international advocacy. So we're working very closely with the UN Commission of Inquiry, which issued a very important report in June of just last month. I would encourage you to read it, which was very powerful and damning and calling for an end to the systemic impunity that prevails across the board. And we're here for that purpose. Adala is now establishing a US presence because this is where change needs to happen. This is where that commitment to human rights and the commitment to an end and a just end is going to be written here. And for those of you who care about this, and I'm grateful again to see so many people here, there's a huge obligation, there's a huge responsibility, and if there's any questions as far as what Adala is doing, I'm happy to take that, but I'm also really interested to think together about what we can do, what sort of information you need for us if you're here, if you're working here, and thank you so much.